This week on Words and Numbers, marijuana,
The 3.5% rule,
marijuana,
and marijuana.
all this and more. Coming up next on Words and Numbers, which is a Civil original production. Check us out at civil.com. That's CIVL.com.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
What's new and interesting in your world this weekend?
James, have you heard of the 3.5% rule?
I have not.
This is a political science thing.
Well, that would explain why I'm ignorant.
Yeah, I gather it doesn't date back that far, but here's the thing. Some researchers have looked at 323 violent and non-violent protests in countries from 1900 through 2006. And they asked the question, how often do these protests result in success, where they define success to mean that the movement achieved the aims it was looking for within 1 year of the peak turnout of the protests, and that it's to be nonviolent, the achievements of the means.
This is going to be almost never.
No, they find a bunch, but here's what they find interestingly. More than half of the nonviolent revolts were successful, and only a quarter of the violent revolts were successful.
All right, so I misunderstood. You're talking about revolts, not about protests, yes?
Well, yeah, I mean, they use both terms. What they're talking about, it appears, is some organized protest that causes the government to, they use the word fail, but I gather it's not in the off with their heads version, but rather more in the what do you call it? Not constitution, the parliamentary version of the government falling.
I see. So it would be wholly irrelevant to the United States.
Well, maybe not. Here's the interesting thing that they found. They're asking the question, what fraction of the population needs to be involved for it to be pretty much guaranteed that the government capitulates, slashes, falls to these protests. And what they find is that with 5% of the population participating, the probability of the government falling is virtually 100%. And furthermore, they say that 5% is a theoretical upper limit because of the free rider problem. That is if you've got enough people out there protesting already, there's no need for you to go out and protest. So you become a free rider. You benefit from the protest without participating.
Well, if in fact that's what you want, right?
Yeah,
a lot of
assuming
people,
that's
a lot of people will be on an other side. Not notice they didn't say the other side, but an other side. Ultimately, what's at heart here, with the root that you're kind of hacking at, is that the 5% is indeed a random sample of the entire populace.
I don't necessarily think that's the case. They're simply saying that 5% of the population turns out for the protest.
Yeah, but it would have to say, I phrased that inelegantly. It would have to say something about the other 95%. Now, it wouldn't be a random sample because they're, of course, self-selecting to go out and do whatever it is they're doing. But in Venn diagram terms, there would have to be a lot of bleed over between the two circles.
What are the two circles?
Of people who are protesting and people who are not protesting but want the same thing.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't address that without getting into the weeds on the paper.
It would simply have to be that way because no government would look at a 5% population demonstration and say, well, I guess we all have to quit now. They would look at it and say, this means a lot more than just 5% of the people out whining about something. We have to dissolve the government.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the key.
And for our American friends who don't really, we don't speak this language in the United States. To dissolve a parliamentary government doesn't mean that the entire thing just goes away. It means that a new government shows up under the old institutions. right? So the prime minister and all of the executive officers, well, they all get fired.
Right.
And then a coalition government comes in, or one party wins enough of the seats that the government is just refreshed. It's kind of like what
people
we
with power
do every.
kicked out.
That's right. It's what we do every 4 years. They do very irregularly. Now, there are also rules that they have to have elections after a certain amount of time, et cetera, et cetera. But when you say the government fails, that doesn't mean the government disappears. It just means it's replaced by a new one.
Yeah. Now, again, I haven't read the paper, so I can't say how broad that term fail or how narrow the term fail is. I could just tell you that's the word they're using. But all of this is a lead up to the following. In June 2025, the No Kings protest, it's estimated, caused 1 to 1.5% of the population to turn out. The most recent October 2025 No Kings protest, which was just a few days ago, it's estimated that 2% of the population turned out. That's 7 million people across 2,700 events throughout the country, all on that one day. If they keep going at that rate, the next No Kings protest may hit that 3.5% mark. The implication being that at that point, there's going to be some serious questions about whether Donald Trump's administration should continue.
But you started by saying it was 5%. Now it's 3.5%.
No. At 3.5%, according to their study, almost all governments fell. At 5%, it's virtually 100%, and that's the theoretical upper limit.
I see. And I will contend that in the United States, this will make absolutely no difference whatsoever.
I don't know. Will it or will it not? Would it be
not.
enough to push for a motion for impeachment? Would it be enough to push for someone invoking the 25th Amendment?
Well, impeachment is whatever the House of Representatives says it is.
Yeah, but they've got to actually get off their butts and say something.
Right, and they're not going to do that because it's a majority Republican House right now. If it switches to Democratic hands in the midterms, which it might, then you might see impeachment. But then you have to take a look at the Senate and ask, are they going to ever convict Donald Trump in the Senate? And I do not think the Senate will slip into Democratic hands. It might, but I don't think it will. And it certainly will not have the numbers needed to impeach, to convict on the impeachment, to be precise in the use of language. So that's not going to happen. And I can predict with near 100% certainty that everything I just said is going to work out about the way I just said it would. Now, the 25th Amendment is another animal entirely. And that falls into the who the hell knows category. Who the hell knows?
Do you want to take a minute to talk about the 25th Amendment?
The 25th Amendment is a mechanism by which a president can be removed. It requires his cabinet functionally to remove him. And it's designed for presidents who have significant mental impairments or some such thing, right? What if the president gets shot in the head but doesn't die? Is he still the president? Well, we can't have that. So now we have the 25th Amendment. All right. What if the president has advanced Alzheimer's?
Right.
Who gets to decide whether the president has advanced Alzheimer's? Because I will tell you that when Biden and when Trump make public, to the extent they do, their medical examinations every year, they're always fit like a superhero. And in the case of Biden, we absolutely know that's not true. And in the case of Trump, we're pretty sure it's not true. So I don't know. I mean, is J.D. Vance going to step up in a cabinet meeting in which Donald Trump is not present, saying we got to get rid of the old guy? He might, but if he does and he doesn't get the numbers he needs to make it happen, he'll be vice president for about 5 more seconds.
Right. Yeah. You throw all your cards on the table at that point.
Yep.
We're happy to announce that Civil members can join me and James for a new lecture series, Words and Numbers Live. Words and Numbers Live is a members-only series in which James and I talk about issues in politics, philosophy, and economics. We take a deeper dive and then invite listeners for a live Q&A session. In this week's session, which starts this Thursday at 5:30 Eastern Time, we'll talk about the knowledge problem. To participate in this exclusive series, subscribe to Civil at civil.com. That's CIVL.com. When you log into civil.com, you'll find an archive of our past lecture series, as well as the collection of all of our episodes of Words and Numbers and announcements about upcoming lectures in our new Words and Numbers Live series. Subscribe to Civil for $5 a month or $50 for an annual subscription. Let me throw out one other poll I saw recently, and it sticks in my mind because I was astounded by the results. This was approval rating of the president, and it was whatever, I believe it was coming from Pew. Don't quote me on that, but it was whatever a recent one was in this past few weeks. Approval rating for the president amongst Republicans polled 98% approve. Amongst independents, 35%. Amongst Democrats, 1%. And that's astounding that you can actually, both the Republican and the Democratic numbers are astounding. By random chance, you would not expect that you would get that close to the extremes of 100% and 0, but nonetheless, those were the numbers. But if you think about that in terms of the fraction of the population that is registered Republican or Democrat, look at the Republicans in this case. The last time I looked, it was something like plus or minus 28% of the voters are registered Republican. So we've got virtually 100% of that 28% approving. And that leaves whatever 100 minus 28 is, you're in the 73% or so, 72% range. Now, there's a chunk of those who are approving, but it's small enough, and I haven't done the math, but I wouldn't be surprised if the number of voters who disapprove of the president isn't pretty close to a supermajority at this point.
Well, no, I don't think it is, right? You conflated Democrats and independents when you threw the numbers out, right? So we've got the Republicans who love him, the Democrats who absolutely hate him, and then it's weird, right? Because the independents come in at about 35-36% approval rating, and his overall approval rating has been bouncing between 36 and 40% for months. So, that's about what you end up with. And we've been living in this world for a long time, right? Minus the time George W. Bush, in the wake of 9/11, had like a 95% approval rating, right? You just kind of take that out as an outlying event that's not going to repeat, or at least we hope it won't. And you look at our presidential popularity for over years, it's really not that big. It's not great.
Right.
We haven't had somebody that captured the public since Reagan. Now, every president obviously has captured the public to a degree, enough of a degree to win the presidency. But we all know what a convoluted mess that is, from primaries to electoral college. And it allows for people who are on the fringes, and it has for a while now, people who are on the fringes to find their way into the Oval Office. And I have long said I would prefer smoke-filled rooms. And for a long time, people called me crazy. But people are starting, and it started last week, as a matter of fact, people are starting to say, James, tell us more about this smoke-filled room business, because it sounds much better. So, maybe I'm getting somewhere with this. You never know. This is how change happens, right? A guy says something, and somebody else says, hey, that's not a bad idea. And they told two friends, and they told two friends, and so on.
Right.
And if you know what I just referenced, you're old. It used to be a shampoo commercial. Anyway, and I want to get us over to marijuana, but I'm going to do it in a very strange way. The Supreme Court will be considering a case asking the question, can pot smokers legally own guns?
I saw that. And the first thing that runs through my mind, of course, is the Second Amendment. Congress shall make no law. So I'm very interested to see what kind of hoops people jump through.
Well, there's always that when you talk about guns, right? It said Congress shall make no law, and we selectively incorporate things from the Bill of Rights, and we have deselected that part until the Heller case at the Supreme Court, where they said, no, owning a gun, like every other thing in the Bill of Rights, I want you to hear me, like every other thing in the Bill of Rights, is a personal right.
Mm-hmm.
Period. And if it's a personal right, well, there you go. You have the right to keep and bear arms. And look, right from the start, if that's true, and I would stipulate that it is every time, how far does it extend? I know I have a right to a long arm because as an originalist read, I know that that's what they had during the constitutional period. All right. And leaving aside all the details of long arms, do I also have the right to a handgun? And I think it's very clear that, yes, I do. Why is it so clear, right? Because that's generally what guns became. All right, so now we're drifting off the originalist farm a little bit here. Do I have the right to a flamethrower? Because, man, Aunt, I want a flamethrower so bad. And actually, I think I can build one, so I probably have the right to that. Do I have the right to a tactical nuclear weapon? At some point in this progression, you and everybody else is going to say, okay, hold it. You've gone too far. So just intellectually, we know there's a limit. We're going to disagree about what that limit is.
Right.
Right. I think automatic weapons, for example, probably should be permitted. That's about as far down that road as I'll go. After that, it becomes very problematic for me. But I'm a reasonable human being, right? I'm an ideologue on the one hand, but I'm a reasonable human being on the other.
Let me clarify something for our listeners, because you know this and I know this, but I want to make sure our listeners are getting it. You ask the question, do I have a right to? And I want to underline, the Constitution is not about defining your rights. It's about defining the limits on the government. So the right question is not, do I have a right to own a handgun? The right question is, does the Constitution empower the government to prevent me from owning a handgun?
It doesn't prevent the government from telling you can't. It doesn't prevent the government from anything in terms of weaponry, right? Because we already know that the Second Amendment in an absolutist way will ultimately fail because it will not protect your right to keep and bear nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So we already know there's an outer limit on it. And sensible people are going to disagree about what that outer limit is.
Our friend Clark Neely, who actually was part of the team that argued the Heller case, I put that question to him once about the nuclear weapon, and he said there's a fundamental difference between a handgun and a nuclear weapon, and that is that the handgun or the long gun or what have you, even if you want to talk about cannons, which people did own personally back in the Revolutionary days, those things are targeted at whatever your target is, whereas a nuclear weapon is indiscriminate. It just blows up everything in sight. And to that extent, if you buy that argument, the same argument can be made for hand grenades, for example. I think the government would be on good footing to prohibit those.
Right. And I don't want to get lost in those weeds because we've got other weeds to get lost in here. Now the question is, and I think the word was habitual pot smokers, can they keep and bear arms too?
Right.
Right. Well, which means the fundamental question here is there a behavior or maybe a characteristic that the government can look at and say, not you. Everybody has this right, but not you. And it gets kind of interesting, right? Because I think most people have come to some sort of agreement that we don't think the lunatics among us should be able to keep and bear arms because they go off and they shoot up a bunch of places. And, look, I've been at gun shows where dealers have looked at somebody and said, I'm not selling this to you.
Right.
I'm just not. And okay, I get it. I really do get it. And if you've got somebody who's schizophrenic, the last thing you want to do is put a weapon in his hand or allow him to go buy one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a clear, thoroughgoing violation of his Second Amendment right. And I'm relying on another right, my right to be safe from obvious potential harm. And can you say obvious potential? Those two words don't exactly go together here, right? There's potential harm, which is not obvious, and there's obvious harm, which is not potential. But, here's where we live on this issue, and it's very difficult. So now, what about pot smokers? Now, every pot smoker I've ever met, and I mean this literally, every pot smoker I've ever met, has been kind of happy-go-lucky, jovial, maybe lazy, these kinds of things.
Right.
What are they not? They're not violent.
Yeah.
So why on earth is this an issue? I'm not exactly sure, but this is the issue that people want the Supreme Court to address now.
But you know who often is violent? People who
Drinkers.
regularly use alcohol.
Yeah, drinkers. So are we on a slippery slope here? Is it going to be the potheads first and then the drinkers because there's way more of them, or maybe the potheads first and then the heroin addicts who tend not to shoot the place up either, but then the cocaine users and the meth users?
Oh, and what about someone who's on antidepressants?
Well, that's going to come into sharper focus pretty soon too, right? Because people on antidepressants are, for whatever the reason, more prone to violence. Mm-hmm. You could sensibly make the argument, well, of course they are. Why do you think they're on antidepressants? They're already not doing well. But I don't know that any good is going to come out of this case. It might be the case that no matter what gets decided here, it's a step in the wrong direction. So one way or the other.
Clearly, people who are in favor of gun rights see the danger of the court saying, yeah, the government can restrict gun ownership amongst pot users. What does the person who is against gun rights, what is the downside to that person if the court says, okay? I mean, how do things change versus what they are now?
If the court says, okay, then, the anti-gun people are going to suffer a significant setback. Right?
Granted, but the game doesn't change versus what it is right now, the status quo.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think everything kind of just stays in place. Mm-hmm. And we might get back to this because we've got marijuana again as the foolishness of the week. Imagine this. Imagine, it's been like a marijuana extravaganza today, hasn't it? And we've got the foolishness, which is a case coming out of, I believe it was New York City. At any rate, I read it in the New York Post.
Oh, no.
So
Chris Wilcox, one of our listeners, sent me that, and I just put it down on my list of quick hits to talk about in the next episode.
Well, you better take it off your list, because here we are. A woman got really, really testy. An older woman got really testy that she could smell the stink of marijuana smoke from her neighbor into her house. And she sued and won. And now that man can't smoke weed in his own house anymore.
Yeah, see, and I don't have a problem with that.
Well, are you sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Because if indeed, let's take it on face value, if indeed the smoke was infiltrating her apartment, and let's assume for the sake of argument, it's not because she had her windows open and his windows were open. Let's suppose that she did whatever reasonable thing one might do to mitigate that, and suppose the smell still leaks through. In my book, that's pollution. So
Okay.
the guy who's smoking is violating her property rights.
And that was largely the argument used whenever cigarette smoking came up in public areas, right? That it was such a pollutant that everybody was going to get sick, blah, 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 which turned out to be a bunch.
And that one I have a problem with.
Turned out to be a bunch of lies. But now you're making an aesthetic argument that it stinks and I don't like the smell, therefore you can't do it.
Yeah,
okay,
now it's
fine.
If she doesn't like the smell in the hallway, forget it. She doesn't have the right to that. But if it's within the confines of her apartment, she does.
I believe these were separate homes.
Oh, really? They weren't even apartments.
An adjoining home is the word that's used. The words that are used.
So likely sharing a wall.
They're going to share a wall. So it's probably something like an old-timey brownstone. I'm looking at the pictures, but they close up her face, so I can't see the building. But she lived on one side and he lived on the other. There's apparently a shared wall. What if he doesn't like what she's cooking?
Same deal.
Or her perfume?
Same deal.
Really? At what point does it become unreasonable?
I would say, in my mind, the line of demarcation is, have you, the person who's being offended, have you done everything reasonable to mitigate the problem? You close the window, maybe you got an air freshener, whatever it is, and still there's a problem. I'd say, it's pollution.
When I lived in California, on one side of my apartment was an Iranian family who cooked with spices that were so foul that whenever they cooked, I would leave. And on the other side of me was a very young woman, 22, 23. And I literally, because I have a very, very sensitive sense of smell, I could smell her perfume in my office. So you think I had a legitimate case against both of them?
Yes.
See, I really don't.
Property rights violation.
I think you have to find a way to live together when smells enter into the picture. But having said that, I will concede that people are complaining almost everywhere where marijuana is legal about the smell.
Yeah.
Right. So something's going to end up giving here. But this brings us to our broader thing to think about today, right?
Before we go.
Well, this is the broader thing, right?
You said something that is worth repeating, that being neighbors, they should work this out.
They should.
And I think absolutely that's the first thing that should happen. You work this out, and 90% of the time it'll work out amicably. You only involve the government and the courts when you have exhausted every possibility.
But you know how I love to sit outside and smoke cigars, right? And you know that other human beings, I don't understand this, but I know it to be true. Other human beings think that's an unpleasant smell. And occasionally somebody named Karen stops by and says something like, "Do you need to smoke that right now?" And I say, "Why, yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
That's why I'm smoking it right now." See how easy this was?
And see the interesting thing here. You change the question when you're outside, because the property rights aren't clearly defined. Who owns the air? And so the smell wafts into your neighbor's backyard. It's unclear that your neighbor owns the air in his backyard. Now, it's very clear within the confines of his house. He's closed the windows and the doors. What's in there is his.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of with you on most of this, right? But I get it. I get that people don't want certain smells. I understand.
James and I are delighted to be working with Civil. For years, we have been pushing people to think about how we can make the world a better place. Civil's mission of upgrading society fits exactly with what James and I have been talking about for years. Civil helps us by allowing us to do what we do best, which is researching topics that are important and communicating these to our listeners in a way that we hope they find enjoyable. To see Civil's extensive list of content, including our podcast, Words and Numbers, and our new lecture series, Words and Numbers Live, visit civil.com. That's CIVL.com. To people who will listen to this and say, well, you guys are splitting hairs of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, let me point out that the underlying principle here is vitally important because it's at the root of that entire argument we had in this country for months about wearing masks. The question is, well, if a person is infected with COVID and that person's walking around outside, that person is doing economically the same thing he would be doing if he were walking around throwing trash out in the street. He's polluting the environment.
Yeah.
How you deal with that requires understanding the property rights at play.
You're going to get some hate mail over what you just said. People are not going to like that. And I'll remind you to send it directly to Anthony. Don't send it to words and numbers. And look, back then, remember what I used to say all the time. I used to say, I think this mask business is really stupid, but I'm going to wear one anyway just to shut people up. Which is kind of like saying the two neighbors should just work it out.
Work it out, right.
Right. And maybe the man can be prevailed upon to delve into the edible market instead of the smoking market, but maybe not, right? Somebody's going to lose here. One side or the other is going to get its way because both can't.
And it's part of living in community. That necessarily we're different, we have different tastes, we have different abilities, and necessarily we're going to collide like this. We work it out. And it's not, I would argue, it's not that one side necessarily has to lose. Both sides could give a bit for the sake of harmony.
Well, hang on a second. And I've just made the executive decision that we're not going to talk about marijuana exclusively. We're going to talk about this because this is really interesting. There are binary situations, right, where one side will win and the other side will not. Because if I'm smoking my cigar and somebody says, I don't want you to smoke your cigar, my response is going to be, I'm sorry, I don't care what you want. I'm in my own backyard. It's a private setting. That you even walked down my driveway to say this to me is offensive. So now you have to go. And that person doesn't get what he wanted. He will never get what he wants unless he sues me and some court agrees with him or brings me through an HOA meeting or, some stupid nonsense like that. But there are all kinds of things like this that people find offensive for one reason or another. And the intellectually offensive, that's the one we always think about. But we don't really give a lot of time to these regular life things that are infinitely more annoying, right? Loud cars. People who alter their cars to make them louder than they have to be. I want to shoot their tires as they drive by. Why on earth would you do this? We have all this technology to make cars quieter, and there's a subset of our population dedicating themselves to making their cars louder. As a matter of fact, manufacturers of electric cars often install engine sounds.
Speakers.
They install engine sounds. Think about that. What the hell? We finally got to a point where a car is utterly silent. You want to make it noisy again? Noise is offensive to me as would be flashing lights, and yet I go places and lights flash. Well, I don't like that. Right? I mean, where and how do you draw lines on these sorts of things? And the easiest observation is, well, you probably don't. Right? You probably muddle on through because this is what living together means. Right? We have a form of pluralism here, right? Where you can live your way and I can live my way, and then we find a way to live our way together, whatever that happens to be. But your way and my way may be very, very different. There are people in the United States who are deeply offended that I don't go to church. I don't care. Be offended. Right? At some point, you have to say that the offense is unreasonable. This is how, a matter of fact, and we've never talked about this publicly, so more hate mail to come, but this is how we got into the pronoun business.
Right.
A group of people said, no, these are my pronouns. And the rest of us said, what the hell is that? Well, I didn't even understand what you're saying. And then it gained steam, and now we all understand. but a bunch of us don't want to play along. I, for example, don't want to play along. And here's why. You don't have pronouns. Anthony Davies, you don't have pronouns. There are pronouns. There have been pronouns. There will be pronouns, but you don't own them. They're linguistic. They're just out there. And what a group of people is trying to do is to change the meaning over time of these pronouns, right? And of course they are. That's what a smart, dedicated group would do, right? And I can give you examples of how this has happened. The word literally, for example, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, means both literally and not literally. Because people have used it so much. They say, I'm literally going to die. Well, no, you're not. The cancer patient in the ICU is literally going to die. You're going to go right on living for a while. But because people used that word so long in this way, now the official meaning, to the extent any word can have an official meaning, has changed. All right, well, how do we get along now when a group of people demands that we use language differently? Not over time, not a natural evolution, but right now, as I say, you will call me X. Now, on the one hand, that's ridiculous. No, I won't. On the other hand, if you said, hello, my name is Anthony, I would just call you Anthony. Right? So on the one hand, if you just tell me something, I'm going to roll with it. On the other hand, if you jump up and down and scream and yell about something, I'm going to take some other kind of notice. And I don't know where it all leads, right? Because in a pluralistic republic, you can't just make demands.
Yeah, but that's the key, is the making of the demands. So, I think back to the cigar thing, and the right way to deal with the cigar thing is, you work it out between the two of you. It's all right. I'm only going to be out here, until 7 o'clock in the evenings. You cook out at 8 o'clock. I'll be gone by then. You work out something. You give and take. Similarly, if somebody came to visit me, I'm introduced for the first time, and the person said, "Look, I use such and such pronoun. Would you mind using them when you refer to me?" I have no problem. The problem is the demand.
Yeah.
Somehow I have a right to be called this, and if you don't call me this, you're going to be in trouble.
Well, you're a bigot.
Well, yeah.
Or whatever. You're a terrible thing. And then me and my friends are going to try and get you fired, shame you publicly, all these kinds of things.
And that's as antithetical to the working it out as the other extreme is of, I don't care what you want, I refuse to do anything to call you what it is.
Yeah, that's probably right. And, on the pronoun thing, if you really think about it, how often do you use a person's pronouns in that person's presence?
In the person's presence, right, yeah.
Oh, it's almost never.
Yeah.
So this is really a thing about referring to someone when that person is not around. This is an electronic living thing. This is an X/Facebook/Instagram thing. It's not about real life. Because in real life, I use the second person pronoun. You. What would you like to do today? What about you? What about you? I never say, and what about her? Because that would imply that the rest of us are going to decide what she's going to do, which is beyond rude, right? So it really is about a different kind of communication. And the rules of that kind of communication are unwritten as of right now. We haven't figured out collectively how we're going to behave in the digital world. It gets a little more focused every day, but it's not fully focused yet, not by a long shot.
The main segment where it's going to be marijuana.
It's going to be, but it turned into community, right? And that's something that people who are liberty inclined rarely think about because they're liberty inclined. They want to see first how they're left alone. They don't want to see first how they must integrate. And community is about integration, and you kind of must. Must is a word I almost never use, right? I make fun of Bernie Sanders because everything he says is a must. We must X. We must then XY. So it's kind of a silly word, but in this case, it's absolutely the correct word. You must integrate to some degree, even if that only means, having a job and going to the grocery store with your earbuds in so nobody will talk to you and this kind of thing. But boy, the minute you have to start interacting with people, problems pop up. The very minute you start, there are all kinds of problems because what you want and what I want are not the same thing. And how can you have what you want and I have what I want when there's a conflict between us? And the answer is somebody's going to lose or both of us are going to lose. And that's kind of it, right? There are very few win-win scenarios when you get to the point where person A does not like what person B is doing.
Well, I don't know. There's a larger perspective here. It could be a win-win scenario. And I give you an example that you're smoking your cigar and your neighbor comes over and says, look, I don't like this. And between the two of you, you work it out and you come to something that works for the two of you. You've now forged a relationship that wasn't there before. In a greater scheme of things, you may be better off.
I get what you're saying, but my answer is always going to be, no, I will not stop smoking my cigar. That's always, literally always going to be my answer. That you don't have the right to come from afar and tell me what I can do in my own backyard.
But notice the difference. If I come from afar and demand that you stop smoking the cigar, absolutely, I understand where you're coming from. But how different it is when I come and I ask. I say, could you do this for me? Could you help me?
So you want to shame me by having this fictional person bring a plate of cookies and say, here, take these cookies, James. I'm a good person. You're going to love me, but I don't like the cigar business.
It's not a matter of shaming. It's a matter of presenting you with an opportunity to be magnanimous.
And I might take that, given any number of activities. I really might. Because I watch TV outside. If you came over and said, man, that TV is keeping me awake at night, I would say, oh, I'm sorry. I had no idea. I'll make sure it's turned down or I wear headphones. Mm-hmm. I would do that in a heartbeat. Wouldn't even think twice about it. But anybody who came over and asked me to stop smoking cigars would get a no for an answer and shown the door, right? Because I'm just not gonna stop. That's what I do. I smoke cigars outside. And other people have things they do that I wouldn't like. The people maybe half a mile upwind of me have these massive parties on the weekends. And I don't want to listen to all the accordion music that comes from those parties. I hate accordion music. I hate it. It's awful. Mark Twain asked what the definition of a gentleman was and said, it's a man who knows how to play the accordion but doesn't.
Oh my God, that's funny.
Right? And then they put out a side of beef on a spit of some kind, and I have to smell all of their cooking, and it smells really good, and I'm not invited, and it pisses me off. All right, man, I guess that's just the cost of doing business, right? They own that house, I own this house. They want to have a party, kids come to parties, they make a lot of noise. What can you do? Right? Okay, I get it. But what I do is what I do, and if you don't like it, you're going to go pound sand too. Once you get down to that level where people become intransigent, and I'll grant you that level is not nearly as high up as we think it is. It's actually pretty far down once you start looking at human behavior. But once you get to the level of intransigence, then there's literally, by definition, no compromise.
Yeah, and that's when you bring in the courts.
When there's no compromise, there will be conflict. And when there's conflict, somebody's probably going to take a hit to his rights.
Hmm.
Right? Because you go to court when rights are in conflict or in apparent conflict. There's a group of philosophically minded people out there that say it's impossible for rights to conflict. I'm not one of them. I think that rights can, in fact, conflict and do. So I don't want to get into that can of worms. I just want to acknowledge that those people are out there and they're not crazy for thinking that. But, and here we are, right? And we talk about human respect a lot. And matter of fact, we just did an entire presentation on it a couple of days ago. And this is the height of human respect right here. How do you live together? And the first thing you have to be is respectful. I mean, this is really non-negotiable. And sometimes being respectful means that you have to put up with something you don't like so much.
And I think that's where the whole genre of the Karens came about. It's not that there's somebody complaining about something. It's that the person who's complaining is apparently of the opinion that they matter more than the other person. That there's
they're wholly
presumption of inequality here.
Yeah, the Karens are wholly unreasonable, and I don't like them at all. And the minute you hear the words, "I want to see your manager," you just know what's coming next. You just know, and it has no place actually in a society like ours. Now, occasionally people are going to be treated poorly and they're going to get angry as a result, right? It's happened to everyone. But if that's your default setting, the problem is you, right? It's just that simple. And only you know if that's your default setting. What more can you say? If that's what you if you wake up every day thinking, I'm going to get somebody today, you're the problem. If you walk into a restaurant thinking, that waitress better give me good service, you're already the problem. And maybe you should take a deep breath. Take a look around and figure out, dare I say it, how to be a little nicer to each other. And on that happy note, I'll see you next time, yeah?
See you next time, James. At Words and Numbers, we spend a lot of time talking about what's going on in the economy and the government. But fundamentally, all of this boils down to one thing. The greatest threat facing modern society is a lack of respect. The people who disagree somehow find it difficult, if not impossible, to discuss their differences in a civil manner. We at Civil are interested in upgrading civilization by encouraging people to engage with new ideas and ultimately engage civilly with each other. If you share this idea, please join us by subscribing at civil.com. That's CIVL.com.